You're listening to the RC Executive Lounge podcast, the show where healthcare revenue leaders share real-world strategies, hard-earned lessons, and bold ideas shaping the future of revenue cycle.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last episode of Season 1 of the RC Executive Launch podcast series. I'm your host, Praveen, and I'm really glad you're all here. My heartfelt thanks to our audience for your overwhelming support to us throughout Season 1 of the podcast series. Thanks to your support, we will be back for Season 2 of the RC Executive Launch podcast series in February of 2026. With that announcement, let's jump right in. I'm very excited today to welcome a guest whose experience spans operations, revenue cycle, managed care, physician relations, and strategic growth in a community hospital environment. Our guest is David Kelly, who serves as the Chief of Ambulatory Operations and Vice President of Revenue Cycle at Mary Rutan Health in Bellefontaine, Ohio. In his current role, David leads both the revenue cycle financial performance and the operational efficiency of the ambulatory side of the hospital and medical groups. He works to ensure the organization maximizes revenue, controls costs, and drives excellence in both clinical delivery and patient financial services. He has been with Mary Rutan for more than 7 years and brings 18 years of experience in the healthcare industry, including more than 14 years in revenue cycle and acute care expertise, and a very strong foundation in business development, physician-client relations, patient access, HIM, and technology platforms such as Epic and Meditech. What I find particularly compelling is David's commitment to the independent mission of a community hospital, ensuring that Mary Rutan remains a vital resource for the people it serves, while still advancing modern operational strategies and financial sustainability in a complex and ever-shifting healthcare environment. He's spoken on a wide variety of topics, such as transparency in leadership. He's also been actively thinking about how social determinants of health, technology, cybersecurity, and revenue cycle resilience intersect and the implications for smaller hospitals and ambulatory operations. For example, he highlighted how cyber threats are now squarely a revenue cycle issue. He said healthcare organizations must recognize that cyber attacks are not a matter of if, but a matter of when. We will talk today about how he's navigating these challenges in the ambulatory and revenue cycle world, how he balances cost, quality, access, and sustainability, and what he sees ahead for community hospitals and revenue operations in the next few years. Now let's welcome David Kelly. David, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the lounge.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to, I didn't realize, close out your first season. That's very cool. Very fun, and hopefully it'll be one that people enjoy to close out the season and help contributes to them coming back. And I also appreciate the very nice intro. It's for me and my personality, I don't always like the stuff being read back just because I don't know, it makes me feel awkward, but I always feel humbled and honored when anybody wants to hear my opinion, because I'm just a little guy in my corner of the world. And, why do people want to hear what I have to say? But it's nice that folks like yourself and your audience might learn something from it. So I hope they do.
David, in this case, it's really the strong opinions and thoughts shared by leaders, visionary leaders such as yourself, that has been helping us grow our audience base. And one of the reasons why our show is so welcome in the RCM community is largely because they always feel that they get such rich insights from senior leaders such as yourself. So we are super excited to have you, especially as the last episode of season 1. And given that we are starting our season 2 from next quarter onwards, we are even more excited that you are the leader who gets to close it all out, and what I would describe as an extremely successful season 1. So thank you so much.
Happy to.
Fantastic. So with that, let's dive right in. Now, RCM environments and finance teams in general face a lot of pressure for so many different reasons. Regulations, payer delays, staffing gaps, and RCM teams always eternally seem to be short-staffed, irrespective of which organization I talk to. How do you go about setting your top strategic priorities, looking ahead, let's just say for the next 12 months, 2026, as well as when you look ahead for the next 3 to 5 years? Obviously, a lot of RCM leaders tend to keep one eye on the long term and another eye on the short term. What does it mean for you and your organization?
Yeah, I think for myself, I'm in a semi-unique position because of my role and responsibilities with the medical group. So I'm blessed, and I mean that truly, that a lot of rev cycle folks are tucked inside of finance. And nothing against CFOs, but I think it's something like 70% of them come up not through rev cycle. And so what is the level of understanding there emerges as a question mark. Whereas for myself, I sit on the C-suite with the CFO. I report to the CEO. And so I am in on organizational strategic conversations. And so that is a blessing because then I can weigh in from the rev cycle's perspective directly into that level that most rev cycle leaders don't have that opportunity. So that caveat out of the way, I think that what I would say is, there are a number of different factors when we're trying to set priorities. One of the biggest ones that we're looking at right now, headed into 26, is patient engagement. And I've heard from some peers around this as well. And I see it when I looked out across the landscape of LinkedIn. There is a rising tide of where in 2020, hospitals and physicians were the heroes of COVID. And I think that trust has eroded over the last few years. And so what do we need to do to earn that back? Do we need to put on community seminars, do an education about, what are your deductibles? What is a copay? What is a co-insurance? People just unfortunately don't understand. And for us, earlier in this year in 25, my CEO came to me and said, how do we do more for our patients? How do we up our charity numbers? How do we help them out? And so we've spent a year looking at peers and looking at methodologies to do that. And we are going to implement some of those in 26. So that patient engagement is a key one because I just, rev cycle folks understand this, but sometimes people don't. The patient encounter starts and ends with rev cycle, from scheduling to balance equals 0. We are the bookends of that patient experience. And so it's very important for us. And then obviously financial sustainability, particularly as a community hospital, which you mentioned that my current employer is, it's important to us to retain that independence as long as is workable in the modern healthcare environment. And so that is not all about cost reduction, and it's not all about upside revenue. It's about the balance between the two. And how do you have the best sort of yield percentage? I say yield so much my team gets tired of it and bought me a mug that says, yeah, what's the yield on it, right? But ultimately, it's that true approach to yield, and it can't all be about cost reduction. So I don't know if that narrows it down enough, because strategic goal setting and project triaging is such a big topic. We could spend an hour just talking about that.
Yep.
But just in terms of that opportunity to speak straight into the C-level is a great opportunity. And if you've got any CEOs who listen, I would encourage them to consider pulling rev cycle up into that level. And then for folks who don't have that blessing, just making sure that you've got that opportunity, even if it's with your CFO, to talk to other leaders to balance their priorities, patient engagement, patient experience against that yield and that revenue performance. At least sitting in the room, if you will, or having that, even if you're just a fly on the wall type of situation, you need to understand where the organization is going so that you can assess how you can fit into that.
Makes sense. And essentially what I'm hearing is the right org structure combined with cross-functional collaboration to make sure all the insights are brought in is important. Yep. Along those lines, you brought up a very interesting point of patient engagement and earning patients' trust, right? And typically, a hospital setting is a place where patients are extremely vulnerable. They're going through something physical, which potentially means that they're probably also stressed out about various different things. One of the things that they stress out is the financial aspect of it, which is where RCM comes in, right? So looking at the financial aspect, we hear a lot about aspects like denial prevention, patient financing, access to financial assistance in almost every major RCM environment, right? So when you look at your strategic priorities for your organization, where does something like denial prevention or patient financing or financial assistance fit into your strategic priorities for the next year as well as for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, as kind of alluded to, for us in 26, financial counseling, patient financing, things like that are very high priorities because of that desire to continue to streamline patient engagement. We've had combined statements for a while, but we're going to be doing a statement review to make sure that it's as understandable as possible for patients. But that is on the patient engagement side. Besides that, you asked about denial prevention and so forth. 15 years ago, the most important transaction in rev cycle, I think a lot of people would argue, was claim submission, right? Like final bill not sent. How long does it take you to get it out the door, get it out the door, get it out the door? And I think, and maybe I'm just biased because I sort of came up through the access front end world, but I think that it has emerged that eligibility is the most important transaction in revenue cycle, because if you don't get the insurance right at the point of registration or at the point of scheduling, at the front end, then everything else after that is broken. The auth requirements, the estimate, any of these types of things. So we have spent a lot of time over the last several years. We've got a nice RQA, registration quality assurance software. We use that. We focused on that, but we're continuing to double down on how do we train people? How do we onboard people? We do have dedicated trainers, even at our small size, in the access space, but based on operational feedback from non-rev cycle operations leaders, we're going to be looking at blowing that program up and revitalizing that for the coming year, because if we don't get it right at the front end, everything else goes from there. And that ties to denial prevention as well, but it's so much more than just merely denial prevention. It also ties to the engagement and to the patient dollars as well.
Makes sense. And as you look at programs like denial prevention, patient financing, financial assistance, and a wide variety of other programs that you have to execute, obviously, no organization has infinite resources to do all these things, which means C-suite is always in a position of having to say no, or in other words, make some really tough choices. Can you share an example of where you had to say no to a really good initiative in favor of something much more critical sometime in the last 1 to 3 years?
Yeah, this was not a major initiative, but it was a really good initiative, or would have been good. And we had to punt it for resource constraint purposes, mostly because we needed to put other stuff first, which was around, we outsource the billing for anesthesia services. And they then use their own team or their own vendor for their self-pay portion, after insurance. And then we've got our self-pay processes. So they're disparate, and patients could get 2 bills, or they could get, multiple statements. And without necessarily wanting to insource or to move that away from the anesthesia vendor, who, we had a third party review them, they're doing fine. But to simplify it for our patients, we were looking at a potential endeavor to combine their balance after insurance and their self-pay processes with ours to try to get to a unified statement. And at the time, that got moved back. There were just higher priority issues. Again, sort of in some ways a small project, but I think for the patient engagement front would have been huge. Now, as we continue to look at 26 and patient engagement, with me, almost nothing ever totally falls off the shelf. We could put things on the back burner. We could put it on the side burner, whatever you want to call it. But so few projects ever truly fall off if they're a decent idea. So do we put this one back on for the next year? That's yet to be determined as we finalize some year-end planning for the upcoming year. But that's an example of where there just weren't enough resources to get it done.
Totally makes sense. With that, let's take a short break. When we come back, we're going to dive a little bit deep into an initiative that David and his team led. So let's take a short break. We'll be back soon.
This episode is brought to you by rchq.com. That's ARCEEHQ.com. The agentic AI platform helping healthcare providers improve financial performance by simplifying patient financing and financial assistance. From faster approvals to fewer write-offs, RCHQ makes it easier for patients to pay and for providers to get paid. Learn more at rchq.com.
All right, we are back. David, thank you so much for having talked about denial prevention, patient financing, and all. Now let's dive into a recent initiative that you and an organization led. We talked about going through an initiative where there were a lot of challenges. So what challenge were you trying to solve with this initiative, and how did it pan out?
Sure. There's always something has become like my mantra in the last few quarters. There's always something, meaning there's always a new payer policy, or there's always something in the EMR that the new update to the EMR breaks or something like that. So where do you spend your time and effort? And I've, as I alluded to before, there's nothing that if it's a decent idea that ever falls fully off the radar, but that means we have lots of irons in the fire, to the point where my dynamic with my director of revenue cycle is I always joke that I come up with the harebrained schemes, and then she has to live with them and then rein me in sometimes. But one that we were able to do earlier this year with a great vendor partner, and they were newer in the landscape, was zero balance review. And I know a lot of people are going to listen to that and be like, well, that's new to your organization. Well, not in concept. We've known about it for a long time. It's just, go back to those resource constraints that you talked about. Yeah, I've got an underpayment team. I've got a reimbursement team looking at payment variances. We were doing a lot of that in-house, so we never really got around to prioritizing having a third party come behind us and doing that zero balance review. And so we did an RFP in the tail end of 24 and picked a vendor, launched with them earlier this year. They were able to launch on what I think was a very strong time frame, get live, and I've been exceedingly happy with the results there. I've already referred them on to a couple other people, and one of the reasons for that is they've been able to go much further back chronologically than my team was ever to go and to win. And we've just had money come in from payers from like 6 years ago. There was no way my team would have even gotten to that. First of all, they just don't have enough hours in the day. But second, whatever tactic that vendor's using, whether it's state law or something like that, they've got a narrower expertise than I'm able to bring to the table in a small community hospital.
I think that makes sense. You talked about working with a partner or a vendor in this case. Mm-hmm. Once you identified the challenge, how did you actually go about selecting the solution or the partner or vendor?
Yeah, without wanting to plug anybody specifically, we have an outsourced vendor management office that we use, and they help us with rev cycle contracting. And sometimes that means a full-blown RFP or RFI. Other times it might mean a closed bid situation. If it's a trusted vendor partner that we've used before, we might go to them and say, hey, we want to add this scope of work. What can you do for us, or something like that? This group, then we treat them as a member of our team. I'm just, I know the big shops, Trinity and Piedmont, a former employer of mine, they've got in-house vendor management. I'm not going to have that. I'm just too small. And so they'll help us with that type of work. And sometimes they'll even help us identify the vendor landscape. Like sometimes, I go to a conference and you're going to meet plenty of folks at a rev cycle conference that are doing early out, that are doing bad debt, but you may not have a great landscape on who's doing outsourced coding or zero balance review in this specific case. So sometimes our VMO partner has even helped us identify vendors, but usually they'll manage the RFP as they did in this case, cast the net out wide, and help us go through the filtration process and the vendor selection process, though ultimately it's our call at the end of the day.
That makes sense. And you talked about implementation. In the implementation process, when you were trying to solve this challenge, were there any unforeseen pitfalls or surprises or lessons that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, the one thing, and it's still a long tail that we're working on with them, is how do we get clean, reportable notes back into our EMR. We do not use Epic. We use another EMR. How do I get those notes back into the system? And why? And for the audience, like, why do I care about that? The main thing is I don't want two vendors working the same account, right? So if I've got them doing a zero balance review and I've got somebody else doing a a charge integrity. Well, charge integrity on historic accounts, if you're doing a retrospective audit, could overlap with a zero balance review. And I don't want to pay a commission to vendors, right? So that's the main thing, is that we still try to solve for that in an automated way, that they can note accounts, cleanly and automatically, rather than anything manual or something like that. So that's sort of a long tail. That's just one example. Overall, it was a very smooth implementation. There's always a few hiccups and technological things, but that's one where, sometimes these things do have long tails even a few months later, and you gotta keep working to pin it down.
Makes sense. And what was the measurable impact of the program, or in general, how did you measure success for such a program?
Yeah, generally, we measure success. We meet with the zero balance vendor monthly. They review what's in flight, what's closed out, what we're still working on, and then what we've received payment on. And so that we get a scorecard with them every month. We go over that with them over month. We talk about, like, okay, what's the real likelihood of some of these dollars? What are we going to win? What are we not? And which is a forecast. I mean, you never know for sure until it happens. And then the actual dollars coming in are ultimately the truest measure of success. Go back to the yield, right? And they're on a structure, they don't get paid unless we get paid. So we're very happy with that. And when you're talking zero balance review, you're talking found money, right? Yeah. Essentially. So, and I off the top of my head, I would hate to say a number, but it's mid to low six figures captured, high six figures in flight, and projected wins, working the way through the appeals process and so forth. And for a lot of folks, if you're at a big system, that doesn't sound like a lot. But for me, 1% of net patient service revenue is like $1 million. So exactly. Stuff in the six figures is a great win.
Yep. Thank you so much for sharing those exciting results. And most importantly, the initiative sounded really exciting. With that, let's take a short break. When we come back, we are going to be talking about up-and-coming technologies and how David sees them impacting RCM in general. We'll be back.
The RC Executive Lounge is proudly sponsored by rchq.com. That's ARCEEHQ.com, where agentic AI is transforming how providers manage patient payments and financial aid. Providers using RCHQ are seeing more collections, less manual work, and greater access for patients in need. Visit rchq.com to learn more about the platform and schedule your personalized demo.
Thanks everyone for staying with us. David, I want to shift gears into technology.
Sure.
We hear a lot about terms like agentic AI playing a role in revenue cycle. What role do you see a technology as powerful as agentic AI playing a role in the revenue cycle, either when you look at 2026 or even the next 3 to 5 years for your organization?
So I've been burned on the speed of AI forecasting, including my own. The folks with the giant purple bus kind of ruined some of the timing for that for some of us. A number of years ago, pre-COVID, I really felt that at that time, within 5 years, if you were super aggressive and bought in on AI, you can have essentially a fully touchless revenue cycle. And I don't think even the most aggressively bought in AI folks right now have achieved that. So I want to hedge my language on a timing forecast. I do think on some level of time frame, the revenue cycle is very much a game of the Pareto principle on steroids. Instead of the 80-20 rule, it's the 99-1 rule. And so if you can automate 80, 90, 99, that is going to yield much stronger performance. And I think that it's somewhat mandatory when we look at talent gaps and labor gaps in the marketplace. Like you cannot be an ostrich on this, and you cannot just do nothing. That said, as we've seen over the last few years, unfortunately, a meaningful amount of this seems to be hype. And so you do have to sort of hedge your bets. You need to make sure you're working with proven partners, or if you're with a development partner, you need to make sure that's structured in a way that it really is a collaborative effort, that neither party is losing their skin on the deal. They're putting skin in the game, but then not losing it on the deal. Losing their shirt is what I meant. And then I think that it is possible, though, to be that development partner. We are a development partner with an AI company. I don't know if it would technically qualify as agentic, but with generative AI work around fighting back on payer takebacks, when they come in and they downgrade your DRG 3 years later and so forth. We're a development partner with a company on that front. But we entered that deal very cautiously. We wanted to make sure that, that my InfoSec and that my compliance team were very happy with the contract, even though it was just a developmental partner. And then for myself, one of the biggest things was I wanted to elongate the development period. I think they came to the table with 6 months, and we said, no, it needs to be 12 because we know these things take longer, right? It always takes longer. So just going in with your eyes open about the pragmatic reality, being careful to not believe the hype, and then at the end of the day, not just sitting there and the world's passing you by. You definitely got to get off the bench and get in the game.
Makes sense. And as you look at these areas, are there specific problem areas in RCM where you think AI or agentic AI can truly shift the game? Not incremental improvements, but transformational, like 5x, 10x type of improvements. If there are, which of those problem areas is your organization actively exploring?
I think that assuming we're using the same context or the same meaning of agentic AI in this conversation, where an AI can function essentially autonomously and potentially interact with humans, I think that one of the biggest things that could be transformative, and I know that there's a vendor out there doing this, and again, I don't want to improperly name drop vendors on your podcast, especially because I'm not a client of this vendor, but outbound payer calls. Right? Like they're using agents for inbound calls on the payer side. Well, why not just get an AI on the line outbound, and then I can free up people to do actual human-facing work where that's going to be more value add versus like, hey, I'm calling to check benefits on Betty Sue and she's got an upcoming therapy visit. Like that does not need to be a human, particularly if they're not going to use a human to answer the questions, right? So I think that could be transformational. It really could.
Makes sense. And outside of AI and agentic AI, are there other new and upcoming technologies that you think are very useful for RCM or healthcare in general that you and your team are closely watching?
New. No, like RPA is, been around forever. It's starting to enter into the healthcare space. Not so new, and so that's a big one. Not so new, and yet in some ways still new is the ambient listening to help with physician and provider documentation. I think that's going to be a big one as that gets perfected. Like pick a doc out of a crowd and ask them one of their number one beefs with American healthcare. And besides, prior auth, it's probably the amount of documentation and clicks they have to do, right? So if we can help them with that, that's major. That's huge. I just don't know that would qualify as new. And then people have been talking about interoperability and in particular shared medical records and how do we get that on the blockchain and so forth. And so I'm not a skeptic on the concept of shared records. I guess I'm a skeptic on how do we blockchain that and who's going to own that and so forth and so on. But I do think that one of the key future states is that we have to have a more mobile medical record for people. And so whether you call it interoperability, whether you call it EMR on the blockchain, I don't care what you call it, but we definitely need to have more ability for patients to be, I'm in Ohio today, I'm in Florida tomorrow, and everybody can see my record. And then hopefully the ambient listening and so forth will free up the provider's time so that they actually read the record, right? It doesn't do them any good to have the record if they don't have time to read it.
It's amazing you talked about ambient listening because, as I mentioned, we are in season 1, end of season 1, And already we have heard this theme come up 3 times, including yourself. So obviously, it seems to be gaining a lot of traction in the industry. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
One last question for this segment before we move on to the break. Um, every C-suite leader typically tends to obsess over one metric every morning, so much so that if that metric goes down, either because of data issue or for whatever reason, heads start rolling, right? So that's the level of seriousness given to that metric by the C-suite leader. What is that one metric for David?
So that for me, it actually comes out of my ambulatory side. So it may not be as useful for some of your listeners, but it's daily volumes. Like every single day, I'm looking at it's like the first thing I do every morning is okay, how many surgeries are on the schedule in the OR? How many patients did we have yesterday in the clinics? And what is that compared to budget? What is it compared to what is it projecting for month end? Every single day I'm looking at that. And if that report doesn't come out in the morning, I'm like, I'm teamsing decision support, like, hey, where's that report? Where's it at? I need it. On the rev cycle side, there's nothing that I'm looking at daily because rev cycle can be, particularly at a smaller institution, it can be very, very spiky, right? Where I get one big batch of remittances on a Tuesday and all of a sudden I drop $3 million in my AR, but then the next day it's right back up. So I try to look at rev cycle metrics more like a weekly basis than I do a daily, just because again, we are, I have one surgeon take 2 days off of PTO and all of a sudden my OR charges are down or whatever. Yeah. So that spikiness means it's not something I'm looking at daily.
And is there a metric even in revenue cycle that you look at weekly or even bi-weekly?
Yeah, so I'm going to routinely look at what's going to matter to me there on the weekly is two metrics counterbalanced against themselves, because it's going to tell me the trajectory of where things are going. And then the monthly metric that I care most about is the net to gross ratio, the yield, right? I talked about that earlier. But in terms of a weekly, I'm looking at the average daily revenue for the enterprise, and then I'm looking at the average daily posting and adjustment. Because if we are posting and adjusting more than our average daily revenue, my AR is going to be healthy. And if you're less, it's less. And if you go get that for more than a couple of weeks in a row, I want to know why we are, falling off track.
So a follow-up question on the metrics.
Yeah.
How much is something like cash days on hand important for a relatively smaller organization in your mind?
So, that's a very challenging question, not because it's not a good question, because it is a good question. Some of it is caveated by like, how much do you have, right? Like if you've got over 200 days, it's not that important. It's important, but it's not that important. If you've got sub 90 days, that's a big deal, right? Because most organizations, I think these days, best practice for AR over 90 is around the 18 to 20% range. And so if you've got a fifth, let's say a fifth of your AR that's over 90 and you've got sub 90 days cash on hand, you could run into a big problem real fast, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're in the more 120, 180, plus 200 plus, it's important. You have to keep an eye on it, but it's not something that like every day or every week you're watching. And so the CFO and I do talk about that every month. He and I have a meeting every month, kind of a close meeting type of deal. And we review that. We review net revenue and so forth. And we review days cash. And I think that go back to the element of your question around the small hospital, right? That can again be somewhat spiky, because if we have a large bond payment or 3 paychecks in the month or something like that, that hits all organizations, of course, but a smaller organization or a smaller institution like us, the denominator of the equation, if it can move fast, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. Great set of insights on metrics and other aspects of technology. Thank you so much, David. With that, we'll take a very short break. When we come back, we're going to pick David's brain on some of the leadership challenges that he faces and in general that he anticipates in this kind of an RCM environment. Stay tuned. We'll be back.
Today's episode is sponsored by rchq.com. That's ARCEEHQ.com. If you're looking to reduce friction in patient payments and increase access to financial assistance without overwhelming your revenue cycle team, RCHQ's agentic AI platform might be exactly what you need. Head to rchq.com to learn more.
We're back online. David, as I mentioned, let's jump into leadership challenges in an RCM environment, right? One thing that I've heard from multiple RCM leaders is RCM is a highly fast-paced, constantly changing environment. And change is hard for any environment, more so for RCM environments. So how do you build momentum for change across your teams, especially for complex initiatives?
So I think the main thing that I try to do, and I'm enough removed from the day-to-day that I want to caveat my answer. The day-to-day meaning claims processors or registration. I'm interacting with their leaders more often. But I think the main thing that I try to do is to really connect with and try to help them connect with the patient and the why and the mission of independence for the organization. Those three things. Because it's really easy for rev cycle at any size organization to become disattached from the patient care, right? We often, except for access, we often sit in back rooms or remote in our own house, right? And you're not seeing the patient care. You're not seeing the outcomes. And to some extent, you've got a work queue that's got 100 things on it today. You work 50 of them, and tomorrow you come in, it's got 100 things on it. So it's just this never-ending pile of whatever. So connecting to the patients and helping them understand how it's going to help. And then for us as an independent hospital and trying to stay that way, that is something that really resonates with my team, is just trying to focus on like, here's how this helps us stay independent and sustainable to still be here independent 10 years from now. And like, I will often repeat that, and I'll repeat it to both when trying to build momentum for change, both on the rev cycle side and on my ambulatory side, because I think all of those team members are bought into that mission. So if I'm leaning on something they're already bought into, I'm going to get further that way than trying to force them to buy into whatever I'm doing. But you got to connect the dots between, hey, independence and Project X. How do these connect? You got to do that work. And so that's the three prongs that I would say to try to build the buy-in.
That's a very powerful insight. Essentially, what you're saying is help them connect emotionally with a vision and tie the everyday 5-foot level items to how it ties back to the mission. That's a really powerful insight. Thank you so much, David.
You're welcome.
If you were to give one piece of advice to a fellow RCM leader or a finance leader who's tackling similar challenges in another environment, what would it be?
I try to, sometimes people talk about you got to have a personal brand. You got to have a personal brand. And that brand has to be genuine in order for it to matter. And one of the things that I try to have as sort of my number one byword in my brand is transparency. And that may not fit for everybody. That's a byword that works for me. But if you think it might work for you, and maybe you're not as transparent as you could be, you're sitting there and you're listening, you're like, I don't know if transparency, what does that mean? It means not inappropriately sharing business strategies and secrets, obviously, but sharing with your team not only the why you're doing things and the connection to mission like we just talked about, but also to some extent, you don't want complaints to run downhill, but sharing with them if you've got frustrations, or if you have this thing where like, hey, gang, you told me we should do this project. I went to bat. I did the ROI, I presented it, and it got shot down. And that's frustrating for me because I was really trying to get that win for us. Your team needs to know you're not a robot. And a lot of us, just if you have personality traits in common with me, I may or may not have been accused of being a robot earlier in my career. And I learned, like, no, you got to share. Again, you don't want too much complaining to go downhill. That's a bad example to set for your team. But to some extent, they need to see those frustrations. They need to see the work you're doing on their behalf and so forth and so on. Because I think that it builds trust. And at least that's been my experience, is that if you're able to be as transparent as is reasonable within the confines of a business environment, you seem to get, or I seem to have gotten in my career, more engagement and more buy-in from my teams. And so that's what I would say. But again, that doesn't fit all personality styles. If you're hearing this and transparency is not a sweater that's going to fit for you at the company party, another thing that I would consider as an alternative for you is to think about this, which is, I heard somebody say that trust is a currency. And so you can have money, trust built up in the bank, or you can have spent it all. And so think of when you're interacting with your team, with your peers, with your boss, on any given endeavor, like, am I doing the things necessary to improve my stockhold of currency of trust? Am I following through on the stuff I said I was going to do? And if I can't follow up on a given thing, am I committing to it, or am I maybe hedging my language and be like, I can try to work on that, or help me treat it? Because if you fall down on that, then you're going to erode that trust, and you're going to want to be able to have that trust in the bank for when you do go to the table and say, look, I know on the face of it, this ROI of this project, it may not be great, but trust me, it's going to be worth it to the enterprise. We should do this project. And if you've got that bank of trust, it's going to help you. So that's the alternative. If transparency is not your bag, consider looking at that trust as a currency, and how do you make deposits in the bank all the time so that when you really need to make a withdrawal, it's great and it's going to work for you.
And personally, to me, hearing you talk about those two things, I almost feel like they're connected very closely with each other, right?
Yeah.
Because every leader has to manage the peers, and manage, direct reports. And transparency works across all three spectrums. But also, trust building requires a certain level of transparency that is custom tailored to the audience, right? So transparency is a really powerful tool that, when used right, can help you build trust, and build trust in the bank that can be utilized later. That's a really powerful insight, David. Thank you so much for that. One last question to close out the podcast for the day. Is there a recent book, a podcast, a framework, even an Amazon Prime video, a Netflix video, or anything that you've listened to, that you've seen, that have personally influenced your leadership style or your leadership thinking in the last 6 months to 1 year?
I'd be more hard pressed to say something recent. Honestly, I've thought about this. I know. We did a little bit of pre-review on the direction of some of these questions, and I'd be hard pressed on a leadership book or podcast or something recently. There are two that are less recent. And then I'll talk about an experience that is more recent, but it's less about leadership than more about just stress management and so forth. So the two that are a little older that are more about leadership are Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, and where he talks a lot about distributed leadership and so forth. And then one that a lot of the audience might know, but it's Jocko Willink's book, Extreme Ownership. And trying to take, you're the captain of the ship, like you need to take ownership for things. Hey, I may not be communicating very well on this, boss. Let me try again. Hey, team, you didn't understand the directions. Let me see what I can do to give you better directions, right? So those two, both from former Special Forces guys, been very influential to me on trying to manage how I lead people, or how I at least try to lead people. The more recent experience that impact just outlook and stress management. This summer, my family and I took a trip to the British Isles, and we're out in rural, Scotland or something like that. There's like no humans there. There's like no, it's empty. If anybody's ever been to the Highlands of Scotland. And but you see these cabins and you see this, and it's like there's people living here and they're making a living, they're making their way, and it just sort of hit me like, well, so much of how we live is a choice, all of us.
Yeah.
I have a high level of title, which gives me a blessing in terms of income, but it also gives me a lot of stress and whatever. It's like, yeah, but I've chosen that. Tomorrow I could go quit and go find a job. If I'm willing to make the offsets in my lifestyle, I can go make a choice. And that has definitely helped me to be like, look, so much of this is a choice. So much of how long is your commute? How stressful is your job? All these things. It could be scary to make the requisite changes and the choices that are different to take you on a different path. But if you're out there and you're feeling stuck and frustrated, because RCM can feel that way sometimes, maybe you need to make a different choice, and that could be hard, but I encourage you to at least think about it.
That totally makes sense. Some very powerful insights today from David. David, thank you again for sharing such wonderful insights with our audience. I know, especially being the last episode of season 1, our listeners will walk away with a lot of practical takeaways and a lot to think about, after listening to this episode. To our audience, thank you for tuning in to the final episode of season 1 of the RC Executive Launch podcast series. As I mentioned, we'll be right back in the first week of February for season 2. We have a wonderful set of guests, very similar to David, who will be joining us in season 2. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever platform you listen on. And if you would like to be a guest on a future episode, head to rchq.com and look up the Revenue Cycle podcast series link to learn more. Until next time, I'm Praveen, and this is the podcast where RCM leaders lead the conversation. Thank you, David.
Thank you.